In late 1944, under the scorching Arizona sun, Camp Papago Park shimmered like a mirage, its barbed wire fencing a stark line against the endless, creosote-scented desert. For thousands of Japanese prisoners of war, newly arrived after grueling journeys across the American continent, the landscape itself was a bewildering enemy. They had been told to expect a technologically advanced, monolithic adversary. Yet, what many saw guarding their new desert prison was an image so profoundly disorienting, it defied belief. Men on horseback, their faces and clothing speaking of a different, older world. Apache scouts, members of the U.S. Army, patrolling the perimeter. This wasn't the enemy they knew. And if you're watching this, I'm curious, where in the world does this story find you today? Let us know in the comments below. This stark paradox, primitive warrior culture serving the very modern industrial power they were fighting, hung heavy in the dry, hot air. Among the new arrivals was Captain Kenji Tanaka, a former Imperial Japanese Navy pilot, shot down over the Pacific. He clutched a small, worn calligraphy brush, its bristles a faint whisper of a disciplined culture he desperately tried to uphold amidst the indignity of captivity. His motivation was simple: survive with honor, and somehow understand this strange enemy. But how could he reconcile his unwavering loyalty to an emperor god with the unsettling humanity he sometimes encountered from his captors, especially these unexpected desert guardians? Overseeing aspects of the camp's intelligence was Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, an American officer with a sharp mind and passable Japanese. She often absently smoothed the cover of her well-thumbed Japanese-English dictionary, a tool and a shield against the complexities of her role. Her dilemma was a constant tightrope walk, balancing the military's stringent security demands with the ethical treatment of human beings. The tension was palpable in every interrogation report she reviewed. Out on the sunbaked trails, Corporal Hoka Yazi, a Navajo scout, rode with a quiet authority, his heavy silver turquoise belt buckle glinting under the relentless sun. His motivation to serve the U.S. Army was complex, rooted in protecting ancestral lands and upholding a warrior tradition that predated any global conflict. But how did these indigenous warriors, often marginalized in their own nation, come to be an integral part of American defense, especially in a war fought across oceans? What was the actual impact of their presence on the Japanese prisoners' morale and their perception of their captors? These were questions that would ripple far beyond the camp's barbed wire, altering perceptions in profound, unexpected ways. The wind, a constant sculptor of the desert landscape, carried the scent of creosote and distant dust across the camp's perimeter. Corporal Yazi, his eyes scanning the horizon, often felt the heavy silver turquoise buckle of his belt grow warm under the Arizona sun, a tangible link to generations who had ridden these lands. For the Japanese prisoners, peering through the barbed wire, these riders were an enigma wrapped in an unexpected uniform. Their initial surprise, a jolt to their preconceived notions of American might, quickly morphed into a quiet, persistent curiosity. They are from here. A young prisoner, Private Akira Sato, once whispered to his bunkmate, his voice barely audible above the camp's dull hum. Sato, a former art student, had already begun sketching the distant saguaro cacti, an unusual deviation from the usual focus on escape plans, a subtle shift Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins noted in her intelligence summaries. Jenkins, often running a hand over the well-worn cover of her Japanese-English dictionary, meticulously reviewed the daily interrogation reports in her Spartan office. She looked for patterns, for any useful data that might explain the subtle but noticeable shift in the prisoner's demeanor. The reports, filled with mundane details of camp life, began to include recurrent, almost bewildered questions about the Apache scouts. Do they truly serve the American emperor? One report quoted a prisoner asking. This wasn't just idle chatter. It was a crack in the monolithic image of the enemy, a fascinating psychological opening. But how did this seemingly primitive presence fit into a modern war machine? And what did it truly mean for the morale of 1,500 Japanese POWs, confined in a place so alien to them? The dry air, thick with unspoken questions, seemed to weigh on the very fabric of the camp. Captain Kenji Tanaka, meticulous even in captivity, recorded his observations in a small concealed notebook, using his worn calligraphy brush to ink precise characters. He noted the Apache scouts' silent efficiency, their horses moving with a grace that seemed to defy the rugged terrain. He observed their unique ability to disappear into the landscape, only to reappear moments later, a skill that both unnerved and deeply impressed him. Tanaka, a man of rigid discipline, found himself grappling with a profound intellectual dilemma. How could such an ancient warrior culture be seamlessly integrated into the very modern industrial power he was fighting? It was a paradox that challenged every assumption he held about America, about war, and about honor. He knew the official narrative of his own nation's strength, but this visual, this daily reality of the Apache was a stark, living counter-narrative. If you're finding these hidden layers of history as compelling as we do, consider subscribing to Whispers from WW2. We delve into these untold stories, revealing the complexities often lost in the grand narratives of conflict. The Scouts, leveraging their unparalleled knowledge of the desert terrain and their tracking skills, were not merely symbolic figures. Their presence significantly reduced escape attempts, their ability to read the land making any breakout nearly impossible. They moved with a quiet authority, their eyes missing nothing, the glint of their rifle barrels a constant reminder of their active role. The sun beat down, turning the dust into a shimmering mirage, but their vigilance remained unbroken. Every morning, as the sun began to paint the distant Superstition Mountains in hues of rose and gold, Corporal Hokayazi would cinch the heavy, silver turquoise belt buckle around his waist. It was a piece of his heritage, a silent connection to generations of warriors who had known this land long before any barbed wire scarred its surface. Yazi, a Navajo scout, rode with a quiet authority, his eyes scanning the horizon, reading the subtle shifts in the desert floor for any sign of disturbance. His motivation to serve the U.S. Army was complex, rooted deeply in protecting ancestral lands and upholding a warrior tradition that predated any global conflict. Yet his dilemma was palpable, navigating the prejudices from both the white American soldiers he served alongside, who often saw him through a lens of exoticism, and the Japanese POWs, who frequently viewed him as a curiosity, or worse, a savage. They were men from distant islands, suddenly confronted with a landscape and a people utterly alien to their experience. The dry, creosote-scented air carried the scent of dust and distant mesquite, a stark contrast to the humid green landscapes many of the prisoners knew. How did these indigenous warriors come to be an integral part of American defense, especially in a war fought across oceans? This was a question that lingered unspoken in the desert air. Inside the camp, Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, a sharp-eyed American officer, often absently smoothed the cover of her well-thumbed Japanese-English dictionary. It was both a tool and a shield. Her motivation was clear: to glean any useful information from the approximately 1,500 Japanese POWs and to ensure military protocol was followed. But her dilemma was the constant tightrope walk between the military's security demands and the ethical treatment of human beings. The tension was palpable in the daily interrogation reports she reviewed, filled with bureaucratic language that often failed to capture the human element. One such report noted the prisoners' unusual preoccupation with the perimeter guards. The stark contrast between the prisoners' rigid understanding of their enemy and the complex reality of Camp Papago Park was a constant source of quiet observation for Jenkins. The very presence of these 36 Apache scouts patrolling the vast perimeter was a consistent visual reminder of America's diverse, often contradictory identity. It was a detail that defied easy categorization, hinting at a deeper story within the larger conflict. If you're finding yourself drawn into these overlooked corners of history, where the unexpected reshapes our understanding, consider subscribing to Whispers from WW2. We delve into these untold narratives, exploring the nuances that official records often miss. Jenkins' reports occasionally mentioned Captain Kenji Tanaka, a former Imperial Japanese Navy pilot. Tanaka, clutching his small, worn calligraphy brush, was a man whose motivation was simple: survive with honor, understand this strange enemy, and perhaps one day, return. His dilemma, however, grew daily. How to reconcile his loyalty to an emperor god with the unsettling humanity he sometimes encountered, particularly from these unexpected desert guardians. He watched the scouts, their movements fluid and silent, their horses kicking up small puffs of dust that hung in the still air. The question wasn't just who they were, but what they represented in this bewildering new world. Captain Kenji Tanaka, with his worn calligraphy brush, found solace in the precise strokes, a small act of defiance against the chaos. He meticulously observed the Apache scouts, their horses lean and powerful, kicking up small clouds of red dust that hung in the still air, catching the late afternoon light like suspended particles of amber. He noted their quiet efficiency, the way their eyes scanned the horizon, movements fluid and silent. His initial bewilderment slowly gave way to a grudging respect, a recognition of a warrior's discipline, even if it was in the service of his enemy. But this observation only deepened the core paradox. How could such an ancient, seemingly primitive force be so seamlessly integrated into the modern American military machine? Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, poring over daily intelligence reports in her small, sun-baked office, often found herself noting Tanaka's subtle shifts in demeanor. Her fingers absently traced the worn cover of her Japanese-English dictionary, a constant companion. The reports, often dry and bureaucratic, occasionally contained a flicker of the prisoner's internal struggles. A recurring theme was the sheer disbelief surrounding the Apache guards. "They are not Gaijin," one translated remark read, "yet they are American soldiers. It is a puzzle." Jenkins understood the strategic value of this disorientation. These were not the monolithic, factory-produced soldiers the Japanese propaganda had described. America, it seemed, was far more complex than a simple industrial power. The camp housed approximately 1,500 Japanese POWs, and the presence of 36 Apache scouts patrolling its vast perimeter was a consistent visual reminder of America's diverse, often contradictory identity. Corporal Hoka Yazi, a Navajo scout, rode with a quiet authority, his heavy silver turquoise belt buckle glinting faintly under the sun. His motivation to serve the U.S. Army, though complex, was rooted in protecting his ancestral lands and upholding a warrior tradition that predated any global conflict. He navigated the prejudices from both the white American soldiers he served alongside and the Japanese POWs who often saw him as a curiosity, or worse, a savage. Yazi, however, saw only his duty. He understood the nuances of the desert better than any map, reading the wind's whisper and the faint tracks in the sand. How did these indigenous warriors come to be an integral part of American defense, especially in a war fought across oceans? The answer, like so many truths, lay buried beneath layers of history and necessity. If these unique perspectives, these untold stories, resonate with you, consider subscribing to Whispers from WW2. We delve into the forgotten corners of history, bringing to light the human experiences that shaped our world. Beyond the initial shock, Did these unique encounters lead to any deeper, unexpected cultural exchanges within the confines of the barbed wire? One young prisoner, a former art student, had begun sketching the desert flora and the distant saguaro cacti, an unusual deviation from the expected focus on escape plans. This small act of observation, of finding beauty in an alien landscape, hinted at a deeper unspoken shift. The Apache patrols, their figures silhouetted against the vast Arizona sky, were not just guards. They were living symbols of a reality far more nuanced than any prisoner had anticipated. The young art student, whose name faded into the camp's daily reports as merely Prisoner 734, began to fill pages not with escape routes or tactical diagrams, but with the stark, sculptural beauty of saguaro cacti, their arms reaching skyward like ancient sentinels. He'd capture the subtle shift of light across the desert floor at dusk, the way the creosote bushes release their pungent, earthy scent after a rare rain. This simple act of observation, of finding an unexpected beauty in an alien landscape, hinted at a deeper, unspoken shift within the camp. It suggested that the Apache patrols, their figures silhouetted against the vast Arizona sky, were not just guards. They were living symbols of a reality far more nuanced than any prisoner had anticipated. Captain Kenji Tanaka, a man whose every fiber was woven with the discipline of the Imperial Navy, found himself wrestling with this visual dissonance. He'd watch from behind the wire, his own worn calligraphy brush clutched tight as Corporal Hoka Yazi and his fellow scouts rode by. The glint of silver on Yazi's turquoise belt buckle, a flash of ancient craft under the harsh sun, stood in stark contrast to the modern U.S. Army uniform. Tanaka's initial disdain for a primitive people serving a technological giant began to fray, replaced by a grudging respect for their mastery of this unforgiving land. He recorded his observations in a clandestine journal, a mix of tactical analysis and personal bewilderment, the ink drying quickly in the arid air. How could such seemingly disparate worlds coexist within the same enemy force? Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, poring over intelligence reports in her small, dust-filtered office, noted these subtle shifts in prisoner behavior. The camp's security logs, typically filled with mundane entries, now occasionally included mentions of prisoners staring intently at the Apache, not with hostility, but with an almost anthropological curiosity. She'd smoothed the cover of her Japanese-English dictionary, its pages worn thin, wondering if these quiet observations were a form of psychological warfare or something far more human. One report, dated November 1944, detailed how a small group of prisoners had attempted to mimic the Apache's method for tracking desert animals, a detail Jenkins flagged as unusual cultural engagement. It begged the question, did these small, almost imperceptible bridges of shared observation ever lead to something more direct? Corporal Yazi, unaware of the meticulous notes taken on both sides of the fence, continued his patrols. The rhythmic thud of his horse's hooves on the sun-baked earth was a familiar comfort. He saw the prisoners watching him, their faces often a mask of inscrutable curiosity. He understood their confusion. He felt it himself sometimes, caught between his Navajo heritage and his uniform. Yet he also saw the shared humanity, the glint of fear, or sometimes a flicker of recognition in their eyes as he rode past. He knew the desert, its secrets, its dangers, and in that shared understanding of a formidable landscape, a silent, almost imperceptible connection was forged. But how deep could such a connection truly run, given the barbed wire and the chasm of war that separated them? The silent question that hung in the desert air about the depth of connection across the barbed wire found its answer not in overt gestures, but in the subtle shift of perception. For the newly arrived Japanese prisoners, the initial shock of seeing Apache riders, as detailed in many of their later observations, began to morph into something more profound. It wasn't just that these men were here, it was who they were, and what their presence truly signified about the enemy they faced. Captain Kenji Tanaka, for instance, initially dismissed Corporal Yazi and his fellow scouts as an exotic, almost anachronistic curiosity. Yet, as days turned into weeks, Tanaka, a man of sharp intellect, started noting the precision of their patrols, the almost supernatural ability they had to track even the faintest disturbance in the sand, the way their horses moved with an innate understanding of the unforgiving terrain. He began to see past the initial, bewildering image. In his clandestine diary, later recovered and translated, Tanaka wrote, "They are not merely savages, as our propaganda suggested. They are warriors, yes, but of a different kind. Their knowledge of this land is absolute. They are part of this America, intimately, deeply." This was a shattering realization for a man whose worldview was built on a singular, monolithic image of the enemy. The dry desert wind carried the scent of creosote and the weight of a collapsing ideology. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, reviewing the daily intelligence summaries, saw this shift reflected in the prisoners' own reported conversations and even in their artwork. One young prisoner, whose initial sketches focused on escape routes, had begun to render the distant saguaro cacti and, remarkably, the silhouettes of the Apache riders against the setting sun. The Japanese are not just surprised, Jenkins noted in an internal memo, dated November 1944. They are reevaluating. The scouts aren't just guards. They are an active, highly effective component of our security, leveraging ancient skills in a modern conflict. This is not primitive. It is an integrated, formidable force. The revelation was clear. These indigenous warriors were not a token gesture or a historical relic. They were uniformed, disciplined servicemen, their unparalleled knowledge of the desert making them an indispensable asset to the U.S. Army. This recontextualized everything. The paradox wasn't that a primitive warrior culture served a modern industrial power. It was that the very definition of modern and power was far more expansive, far more diverse than the Japanese prisoners, or indeed many Americans, had ever conceived. It forced a confrontation with an America that was internally complex, rich with histories and peoples that defied easy categorization. If this insight into the unexpected layers of history and strategy has given you a fresh perspective, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps us know these deeper dives resonate. This wasn't just about Apache riding horses. It was about the profound, unsettling realization of what that truly meant for the war, for perception, and for the very idea of an enemy. The practical consequences rippled through Camp Papago Park, extending far beyond the barbed wire fences. Intelligence reports, like those overseen by Lieutenant Jenkins, began to include detailed cultural observations from the POWs, noting their genuine surprise and the questions that arose concerning the Apache. Security protocols were refined, often incorporating the scouts' unparalleled insights into desert conditions, significantly reducing escape attempts. While overt fraternization was forbidden, these unique encounters subtly chipped away at the rigid walls of wartime animosity. Repatriation data, eventually compiled in 1946, would later show a surprising number of Japanese POWs expressing a nuanced, rather than purely hostile, view of their American captors. The paradox, then, wasn't a flaw in America's modernity, but a profound testament to its complex, layered strength. It revealed an America capable of integrating ancient traditions with modern warfare, a force far more diverse and adaptable than any propaganda could convey. This wasn't merely a strategic advantage, it was a quiet, human redefinition of what an enemy and a nation could be. If this story sparked new thoughts on the unexpected layers of history, share your reflections below. What other historical paradoxes have redefined your understanding of conflict? And for more deep dives into the untold stories that shape our world, consider subscribing to Whispers from WW2.